As many of you know, there has been a flood of Q posts, so I'm going to get right to it, not waste any time. 1016 is a carryover, but it includes the payments that were supposedly made. $1.8 million to Cory Booker, $3.5 million to Chuck Schumer, and $400,000 to Chris Christie. And then it says where they might have picked up the money, which goes back to the Obama and Pelosi, and I believe it was Clinton was the third one, maybe Kerry, that were paid off over the last year as they went around the world and picked up money at banks. At least that's the allegation, right? Interesting here that Chris Christie is supposedly getting $400,000, and if you recall during the primary elections, Christie was one that dropped out of running for president and endorsed Trump, and they were chummy for a while, and Christie kind of thought he was going to get to be the vice president or the secretary of state or something like that. And then they had an amicable, outwardly appearing falling out, which was probably precipitated by the fact that Trump found out some things that he did not want to drag into his administration for good reason. And if this is the case, that would be one of them. This may well mean that Christie's on the hook for being prosecuted at some time in the future, assuming all this shakes out. So the next posting is from, or the next half of it has to do with crossing the schedule between and including White House visitor schedule in early 17 and late 16 with Obama. I did not find the exact stuff on that. Somebody's probably dug it up by now. But a lot of the stuff, which is interesting, Obama's list now requires a FOIA request to get the later stuff after 14, and there's a pretty clear indication that there was a whole traffic of folks coming through in that last 2 months or so before Obama was scheduled to leave, in part because they obviously recognized that Hillary Clinton was not going to be named the 45th president, and so they were doing their last little bit. Some of it was probably sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom kind of thing, for which Obama got paid, $500,000 or whatever it is, but some of it may have been also cleaning up their loose ends and playing little games, trying to lock things in. While I don't like to feed it too much, the senior executive service stuff could have been ongoing at that time as well, and appointments being made. Obviously, all of that goes into the background. So what I did get, and there's another one that has to do with crossing it with the president's schedule. And as most of you know, when the president went to Asia, Obama, I think, went a few days ahead of time, and then I think looped back around afterwards and did so in Europe and elsewhere. There is a list, I have a list of of some things that Obama did. He was active, he got the Profile and Courage Award at John F. Kennedy Library in March. He was in April, he was at the University of Chicago. In May, he endorsed Emmanuel Macron, and who is a Goldman Sachs guy who built his own a party in France out of nothing and won. How does that happen, right? It hasn't happened in hundreds of years. How does it happen? Obama delivered a speech in Milan, Italy in May. In late May, he was in Berlin, met with Angela Merkel. Anytime somebody meets with somebody, you have to say, oh, that kind of deal, right? Well, Merkel and Macron are not people that you want to be closely associated with. The end of May, he was in Kensington Palace with Prince Harry, and they had a friendly little chat, and I think they were discussing things like fishing or whatever, supposedly. They also related to the Manchester Arena bombing that supposedly occurred, which I think is a bogus banner. And it was pretty obvious that it was, and if you have reason to look at it, look at Ole Damagard's report on that. It's been a year or so since I looked at it, but it was very well done, as his always are. In June, he announced his, after Trump announced his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on environmental stuff, Obama weighed in. Then he was in Indonesia, his childhood country, and visiting the current standing former governor and the president, Joko Widodo, and then he was in the Seoul Conference in South Korea, and then he went on from there to, in September, he was with the other presidents, which makes me even more dubious of them, Jimmy Carter, the two Bushes, and Billy Bob Clinton, and they did the Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma deal, how Bill Clinton could hold a straight face while they're trying to help hurricane victims out after what he did in Haiti. And he and HW, of course, worked on a couple things together, supposedly helping out, and were appointed. And that, of course, is just another joke, right? And then he hosted in October, he hosted the Obama Foundation inaugural. Then he went on an international trip last fall and went to China, India, and France. And of course, he was there with Modi in India. He was there with Xi Jinping in China. Then he met the Dalai Lama, which is a sad kind of thing. And then he was in France and met with Emmanuel Macron again, and with some others as well. So the Paris mayor and the former president, Francois Hollande. So, you know, it's just another indication of how endemic and how infused this is, and also the fact that he's the first president, former president ever, to get right into the middle of international affairs and not give credence to his successor. Virtually every president, and even little Amy George W., stayed out of it. Of course, we didn't realize at the time how in tight he was with Obama and with the whole underpinning of both of them. So, but we do now. So, it also provides for there is a comment in there about Analysis Corporation at the bottom of 17. So this thing has lots of little pieces, and some of these pieces are doubled up. The Analysis Corporation was formed in 1990. It was formed by Brennan, among others. It is an intelligence service. It does a lot of intelligence-related stuff for Homeland Security, the FBI, the DIA, and it shows that they have developed a whole range of goods to be sold to the public entities. Now, the fact that Brennan is in and out of the CIA, and then in the alternative time is working on high-tech stuff that feeds to it, is no surprise. But of course, it tells us how tightly they are fixed. It's in McLean, Virginia. Brennan is probably one of the darkest guys of all, and of all the players, that is, not necessarily the dragons, but of all the players. Number 18 is, he notes that it was founded by Brennan, and Anon does, and then Q comes in and says, watch for the magic bot. And the magic bot is apparently a product that links, that will automatically link between WikiLeaks and other sources, and so it is part of the little game that they're playing to get all this stuff tied together. And then Q says follow the loop. 20, Q talks about the National Guard now active, which I think is in part active because of the march coming up through Mexico, but maybe for other reasons. And somebody else probably has some details. I've heard of folks in Texas and others being activated, some in Arizona being activated for a variety of reasons. And it refers to the old drop of Saudi Arabia and the National Guard, and the fact that the Saudis had guard at their border and we had guards at our border at that time. So the next posting, which is kind of gets into where I am most comfortable, has to do with the wealth of the major religious organizations. I know that many of you who have stuck around this channel have been fundamentally in some fashion religious or spiritual or Christian oriented. I think it is fair to say to you that there is if this thing breaks loose, there is going to be some shakeout. And it's not just going to be the Catholics; it's going to be across the board. Where, if in fact the Catholics get shaken out because of their implications with the international process, it is going to shake out and rattle down in through the rest of the religious organizations, because many of them have relied upon the underpinnings of the Roman Catholics and their history, which goes back 1700 years, goes clear back to the 300 and the Nicene Convention, and some of the formulation of how the New Testament was put together, and a lot of that. And I have studied it extensively. I have not gotten into it at all here. It has not been appropriate at this point, but I think it is fair to say to you that if you are a Bible-believing Christian, that is, that every word is believed to be exactly, precisely, and accurate on its face, there may be some shakeout from that as well, because I think the Roman Catholics played with some of this stuff. I think it's pretty obvious they did, and the Romans, even as they were formulating it before the church came into being. So, but to go into the whole value of these churches and recognize that part of the reason that Q points this out is that they're playing in politics, and not only that, they're playing in banking, and part of it has to do with the Vatican Bank. One of the comments that's on Q's thing is that the Vatican Bank is worth $229 billion. I think that is a gross underestimation of it. It may relate directly to bank assets, but it doesn't recognize the value of the Vatican itself, the Holy See, and the rest of that. And to give you a breakdown of some of what Q asked for was Church of Scientology is worth tens of millions. Freemasonry, which was in this list, not technically a religion, but is worth millions all over the world. Protestantism, which they just threw in a pile, is worth a lot. The televangelism is worth at least $2.3 billion. That's a huge sum. That's Robertson and what's his name? Benny Hinn and Joel Osteen and some of the others, and I'll get into them in just a minute. The Episcopals are supposedly in the 6th place. The Church of England is worth several hundred million and earns its worth portfolio of $6.7 billion. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is supposedly worth over $30 billion. Judaism is spread out over the world. What's it worth? Islam, again, both of these are vast organizations. There are estimates in 2012 put the assets of the Islamic financial industry alone to be at 1.6 trillion, and the Roman Catholic Church, which is especially noted by Q over this last couple of days, and they're talking about it being worth 220 billion, but that is again a gross underestimation, and it also does not include the property, the holdings, the church, the churches and temples throughout the entire world, and whatever is hidden. And I'll talk about that in a second. But to take a look at the connection between, it says there's a clown connection. Well, the CIA apparently works with the Vatican Bank because that is a great place. It's a privately held organization. It's not publicly auditable. It's not publicly accessible, and the CIA can use mafia organizations in Italy to launder financial funds through there and then pop them back out, and has done so to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. And there may very well be money in the amount of $1 trillion or more in there. How are they linked? What is the tie-in? Who knows? But we're going to talk about that in a second. And then to get to the evangelists themselves, and I'm just going to kind of flash through this, I found it amazing. I mean, Kenneth Copeland, who I don't have any idea who is worth $750 million as a minister. Pat Robertson, $100 million. Benny Hinn, 42. Joel Osteen, worth $40 million. Lives in a fancy little place, a $10 million home, and has a lot of prosperity around him. Cleflo Dollar, I mean, isn't that an interesting name, worth $27 million. Billy Graham, is he still alive? I don't think he is, worth $25 million. Rick Warren, $25 million, and Joyce Mayer, worth $8 million. And some of these folks live modestly, a couple of them, but most of them, don't have any problem with Rolls Royces and Ferraris and the rest of that, which I find interesting, considering the fact that according to the biblical terms, a wealthy man has about as much chance of getting to heaven as getting a camel through the eye of a needle. So the next point of this is having to do with the loan to the Holy See, and I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. But in 1932, James Rothschild and Carl Rothschild supposedly loaned money to pontificate Pope, or to the Pope Gregory the 16th, in the amount of the equivalent of about $34 million in 2016 numbers. And I found quotes that said it was probably either a 10 to 100 times that, which is interesting because the Catholic Church, even in the 300 and 400 and 500 AD, used purgatory and the payment to get both the sinner and the sinner's families out of purgatory, and to make gifts in the fear of spending eternity in hell for themselves or their families, was a major point of contribution throughout the dark ages of the Catholic Church. One might also note that throughout the periods from 300 or so AD until the end of the Spanish Inquisition, there were as many as 50 million people that died at the hands of the Catholic Church or under their sponsorship through a purging and the rest of that. We tend to think that the Massachusetts purge of witches, so-called witches, and the Inquisition in Spain are kind of the high points or the low points, but there were low points all along through the Dark Ages. And even dissenters within the Catholic Church, when it was formed, that had different ideas, were purged. The Essenes, of course, were chased. The Gnostics were chased. They closed those things down. The Nag Hammadi scrolls were hidden because the people themselves were about to be captured, we think, and didn't come back up until the 1950s. I think they found the scrolls. So this stuff is a pretty dark thing, and the question then is, where does the Catholic Church fit into the plus, the Soros, the Saudi Arabia, and the Rothschild bunch? And the question the other day was, is the Pope there? Is the Pope serving the master? Is the Pope serving the chair? Is the Pope serving the cabal? And who is the master? I think it is clear, given the whole aspects of loan and the fact that the loan is very much real, is that the Vatican Bank may be as much under control as is the Federal Reserve and others, which would make the Pope a vassal or puppet for the bankers, not the other way around. I know some of you feel that obviously that the Pope is at the back of all this, or that a black Pope or somebody above the Pope even is. I think that's hard to say, and we won't know unless and until it shakes out, but that's the part of it. So the next one is one about which I have some familiarity, and this has to do with jock strap McStain. And it is, the Q says, adios, protected flow to Arizona is no more. In other words, that they've closed that off. That's the idea, that it has been frozen. And of course, that is the key to all of this, is how do we freeze the assets to stop the flow and in effect drain the swamp by closing off the tributaries that go into it. He's under cover of his health. He will not be seeking another term. And that's, frankly, let me put it this way. There were a lot of people on 8chan and others that cheered. I'm going to tell you that's not good enough. And why is that the case? Because McCain won another term in 16 and is not scheduled to end his term until 22. There is constitutional question whether a withdrawal or a removal by the state of Arizona is apparently not available constitutionally. It is a federal constitutionally provided position, and only impeachment would take it out, unless, of course, there's a resignation. And if, in fact, the Trump folks get a handle on the criminality, he will resign in 15 minutes if it trades off against sentencing or treason or whatever else. Q promises us there will be no deals, but that's a place where there might be a deal, frankly. It would still be a place for a deal, but the deal has to include him getting out of the Senate. The Anon said, goes into the wall, can't just be for stopping drugs, assassinations, child traffickers, etc. And are there things we don't know about, and having to do with in the event of war and us being invaded? And Q reminded the Anon, would you invade a country whereby a good portion of its citizens are armed, the ultimate deterrent? You know, if you had asked me 30 or 40 years ago when I was becoming involved in the whole legal profession and constitution, if you had said to me, what is the glue that will hold together the constitutional basis for this country, the viability of our republic, I would not have said to you it's the Second Amendment. I would not have said that. And it is something that I have rather had mixed feelings about until recently. And one realizes that there is a thin thread that is keeping this world from tipping over. And that thread is that the United States has not collapsed, has not succumbed to it. And it is only because of the Second Amendment, I think, that there is recognition by the dark folks that they just cannot afford to pull the plug too early. And it's a crazy thought that 300 million guns are saving the world right now, not just the United States, but the entire world, because without those guns, without that firearms and the right to protect themselves, if they're taken away, an announcement of the end of the world as separate nation states would be about all it takes. There would be pockets of rebellion, but it would not amount to much. And it would, the Europeans are gone, the communists are gone, the Chinese and the rest of that, the Southeast Asians, the Australians have given up their guns, the Canadians have given up most of their guns. There is not much left. And so the world could come under if it were not for our Second Amendment. And as I say, 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, you would not have heard me say that. So the next one is 1024, and this has to do with Jared Cohen and the recognition that he's in on it. He is an Eric Schmidt protege. Before that, he was a Hillary Clinton protege. He is still in his 20s. Before that, he was a Condoleezza Rice intern. He's been passed around, excuse me, my voice. He's been passed around among these folks, the neocons and the dark side of the Democrats, and now in tight with the big boys at Google, and he's right in behind them, and saying goodbye to him is a way of adding to the sucker face and at Jack and the rest of these guys. Is Cohen's right behind and wrote a book with Eric Schmidt. So, if they go down, they all go down, hopefully. So the next two postings, one of them has to do with where we go one, we go all. And there were 40 or 50 8chan posts saying, thank you, Q, thanks for everything. And of course, a couple of naysayers built right in the middle of it. One of the Anons made a comment about Putin. I made a comment to you yesterday, I think it was. I think Putin is perhaps internationally Trump's greatest ally. Whether he acknowledges it as such, he certainly cannot acknowledge it publicly. But having someone who says, hey, there is a dark side to this and we are not going to allow it, is critical. And Putin made really clear in his hour-and-a-half speech that there was no aggressive intent at all. Now, could that be a lie? Well, of course it could. But I took it seriously, and basically Putin said, mutually assured destruction, not said that way, includes us as being mutually destroyed, and what a viable, honest, responsible president would do that to his own people. So the Q says for us to watch the news tomorrow. That is April 4th at 21:45, so that would be today. I think I'd cut it some slack and wait for another day. And then the final posting is another one of the 5.5 postings. And there are multiple postings of the 5:5, excuse me. We saw it in February. It was to read it at the time and to check for secure comms and see if everything was a go. In March 6th, there was another one that had to do with raw video, 5:5, the Hillary Clinton raw video. There was another stage 5.5 with a Y that could be interpreted as Baphomet and the dark folks going down, along with the Red Castle, Green Castle stuff, which I don't think had to do with the 5.5. And finally now there's a 5:5, and it is a Q plus on it, and it's the only second one of those. So does that mean this is a bigger Q? Does that mean that this, hey AIM, does this mean that this is Q the 4th? It could be, Q plus could be Q the 4th or the 5th or the 19th, and it could be all fake stuff. So, but in any case, there, as I have said over the last couple of days and even over the last couple of weeks, this is not something that is going to be decided 2 years or 5 years down. This is either very real now or it is not very real. And what's more than that, if it's not real this year and before the general election of the off year in 2018, the world turns upside down, because the Democrats could well take the House if there is not severe adverse publicity related to their taking over. And if that were the case, we're just going to watch 2 years of impeachment attempts by the Democrats to get rid of Trump, assuming that there isn't something more violent that happens. So, all right, well, that's enough for now. It is more than enough. I tried to rush through this, but I think this is a pretty long posting nonetheless. Thank you so much. If you like it, give a thumbs up. And subscribe. And again, I'm going to tell you, there's a big announcement coming, and I think it is potentially huge, and I'm hoping that it spreads throughout YouTube and that is carried on and accepted and adopted by everybody else. But we'll see. All right, thanks so much.